Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Monday, Yom Sheni. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Melissa in Great Neck, Yehud in South Carolina, Stephen in Rome, Maine. That's not where you usually are. Thank you for checking in and staying with the class. Guy in Ohio, Joe in the Inland Empire, Bill in Mid-Missouri, Paul in the Great Northwest, Joe in Boston, Massachusetts, Bella in Florida, Belle in Texas, Shandor in the Bronx, Sharon in New Jersey, Chaim in Florida, Marjorie in Georgia, Marie in Freeport, Aoife in Florida, Ella's in the house. Welcome, everybody. Very short stuff. Let's learn it the best we can. Okay, our daf today is page 37, Lamed Zion, here in Tractate Bava Basra, the 23rd volume of the Talmud. Continuing our discussion of Mishna number 1 here in chapter 3. In a case where there was a field with trees in it, and this person took possession of the trees, and that person took possession of the land. So Rav Zevid says, this one acquired the trees, and that one acquired the land. And Rav Papa objects to this. If this is so, then the owner of the trees has no share in the land at all. And let the owner of the land say to the owner of the trees, uproot your trees, take them and go. Right? If the owner of the land owns all of the land, then he can just eject the owner of the trees. Okay, you own trees. Uproot your trees, go plant them somewhere else. I don't want you on my land. So in other words, if somebody sold the trees on his land, or somebody was having, he was disposing of assets, and to one person he sold the trees, and to another person he sold the land, well, some of that land has to go along with the trees, so that he has not only the tree, but the right to have that tree in that spot. So in other words, if you sell someone the trees, you are selling them some land, very small amount, basically the land under the tree with some kind of a little space around it, enough so that you can work the tree. Right? We're talking about productive trees, trees in an orchard, date palms, etc. So you have to be able to bring, your harvesters and the people who are gonna, they're gonna tend to the tree, water the tree doctor needs to come in, but of course, especially the people harvesting the fruit from that tree, they need space to work the tree, and you get that much land around the tree. Otherwise, if you only had the tree itself, you really wouldn't have anything at all, because the owner of the land around it could eject you, right? And that's not what you get. You, in fact, get that bit of land around it so you can work the tree. So rather, Rav Papa said, this one acquired the trees and half of the land, and that one acquired half of the land. Now, Rav Papa is more generous than where the law ends up. You end up with just the land around the trees, not some kind of large space of the land that contains the trees. And you might have said, well, I have a piece of land, it's got trees on half of it. And so when I said this guy gets the trees, I meant the half of the land with the trees. That's what Rav Papa would infer from such an arrangement, but that's not where the law ends up. Now the Gemara notes, it is obvious that if one sold a section of land and left the ownership of the trees in that land for himself, that he has ownership of the land surrounding the trees, because it was originally all his land. And this is the law even according to the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, who says, one who sells generously, and he is presumed to have included in the sale even more items that were not explicitly specified, because that statement applies only concerning a case such as when one sold land and retained ownership of a pit or a cistern. In that case, Rabbi Akiva ruled that he does not retain any land not even a path to access the pit or cistern, as he sold generously, including all of the land in the sale. Now, obviously, this principle, one who sells generously, this principle of Rabbi Akiva, I mean, it could be abused, right? And of course, these days, when we have purchase and sale of a piece of land, you know, the real estate agents, the lawyers, the escrow people, everybody's going to achieve, God willing, real clarity on what is being sold and what is not being sold. Is there an easement? Is there a detached, shack or garage? Is the furniture going to go along with the house, etc.? So in the absence of clarity in the purchase and sale contract, we might look to this principle and say, well, the buyer assumed that he was getting everything that he was looking at. Why? Because when a seller sells, he sells generously. But that's not some kind of general principle that we can always rely on. Right? So Rabbi Akiva, who says, one who sells generously, and he's presumed to have included in the sale even more items that were not explicitly specified, because that statement applies only concerning a case where, right, so in that case that was given with Rabbi Akiva, right, the seller retained a cistern or a pit. And he thought, or one might have thought, that when he sold the land, he retained the easement, right, the route through the land to get to his pit. But he didn't specify it, and it sounds like even in that situation, we don't apply. One who sells generously. The guy kept the pit. He didn't hold back the land, the path through the land that he sold to get to the pit. He might have retained a right. Certainly, if he specified that right, he could retain such a right to cross that land, but he didn't keep the path as his own land. Now, the Gemara explains the difference between these cases. Between one who sells trees, did the land underneath the specific trees go along with it? And this idea of one who kept or didn't keep a path for himself through a piece of land that he sold because when he retained his pit or his cistern. So the Gemara explains the difference between the cases. That ruling applies there. As the pit or the cistern causes no harm to the land surrounding them, and since the seller does not foresee a conflict arising from his pit and cistern being located adjacent to the buyer's property, he therefore transfers the entire land. But in the case of somebody selling a piece of land and retaining the trees, since they are causing harm to the land in that the trees will keep growing, they will drop stuff on the land, their roots will keep growing and will suck moisture out of the surrounding land, etc. Since these trees are causing harm to the land, the seller does leave the land that is surrounding the trees for himself. As if he did not leave it, let the buyers say to him, uproot your trees and go. The same problem we started with. Right? If you don't keep the land, if somebody who ends up owning the trees doesn't also have the land right beneath the trees, if that's somebody else's land, well, then he has no certainty that he's going to be able to keep those trees because that person who owns the land could say, hey, I don't want your trees, but I don't want them on my land. So take your trees and go. To be protected from that, it has to be, when somebody is, retaining or obtaining trees within somebody else's land, what he gets is the trees and the patches of ground beneath the trees. And that is the law. Now on 37b. Now the Gemara discusses the reverse case. If one sold the trees and he kept the ownership of the land for himself, the law depends on the outcome of the dispute of Rabbi Akiva and the majority. According to Rabbi Akiva, who says, one who sells generously, the buyer has ownership of the land surrounding the trees, as the presumption is that the seller included it in the sale. According to the rabbis, the majority who disagree with Rabbi Akiva on this issue, they say one who sells sparingly. He only sells what he agrees to sell. And the buyer does not have ownership of the land surrounding the trees, as the presumption is that the seller did not include it in the sale. And the Gemara stated previously that according to the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, the buyer has ownership of the land surrounding the trees. So the Gemara clarifies this opinion. And even according to Rav Zevid, who said that in a case where one took possession of the land and another took possession of the trees, the one who took possession of the trees has no share in the land, not the law. That matter applies only concerning the case of two buyers. As in that case, the one who acquired the land can say to the other, just as it is so that I have no share in the trees, you also have no share in the land. But here, where one sold the trees and left the land for himself, there we can say one who sells generously. Therefore, it is reasonable to assume that the sale included the land surrounding the trees. Now, the Gemara stated earlier that according to the opinion of the rabbis, the buyer does not have ownership of the land surrounding the trees. And the Gemara clarifies this opinion. And even according to Rav Papa, who says above that in a case where one took possession of the land and another took possession of the trees, that the one who took possession of the trees has ownership of half the land as well, that matter applies only concerning the case of two buyers. As in that case, the one who acquired the trees can say to the other, just as it is so that the seller sold to you generously, as you have both the land and the right to consume its produce, he also sold to me generously, including the land surrounding the trees. But here, where one sold the trees and left the land for himself, one who sells sparingly, retaining for himself whatever he did not explicitly include in the sale. And that's where that discussion ends. Now, new subject. The sages of Narodea say, if one consumed the produce of an overcrowded orchard, he does not thereby have presumptive ownership of the orchard. Okay, so basically the concept of this overcrowded orchard is that it is an orchard with a liability, meaning too many trees were planted there, and because it wasn't managed properly, we know that some of these trees are going to wither and die. There's too many in too small of a space, so even though there's a bunch of trees standing there now, we know that some of these trees are going to fall down. And then the question is, how does, and it's almost like a treifa, right? So a treifa is an animal that has been injured in such a way that it's going to die of its injury or of some kind of cause within a year. And that animal is not kosher because even though it's alive now, and we could perform a kosher slaughter on it, and it is inherently a kosher animal, the fact that it's going to die soon renders it not kosher. It's like it's walking dead, and something that is walking dead is akin to something that was not slaughtered properly, even if you do slaughter it properly. And likewise here, this overcrowded orchard, it's like some of these trees are already considered dead. So the question is, how does that affect purchase and sale of this property? So the sages of Nehardei say, if one consumed the produce of an overcrowded orchard. Now, consume the produce, what does that mean? That doesn't mean he bought the land. That means that he has the right to the produce. For example, perhaps because he had lent money to the landowner, and now, in order to repay the debt, he is consuming the produce of that land. That would be one example. So what happens? If one consumed the produce of an overcrowded orchard, he does not thereby have presumptive ownership of the orchard. So now what we're saying is, no, this is somebody who is the landowner. He bought the land. Maybe he loses his deed. And we're back to what we've been talking about throughout our discussion of this first Mishna in chapter 3, that if somebody can't otherwise prove ownership of the land because he lost the deed, for example, if he's been working it for 3 years, living there and working it, so then he has presumptive ownership of the land, and somebody who comes along and says, hey, I didn't sell you this piece of land, or I was the prior owner, and somebody sold it to you without my permission. If this guy who's the possessor has been there for more than 3 years, the one who comes and makes the claim, he's going to have the burden of proof. He's going to have to show that the possessor is there illegally, and if he can't meet that burden of proof, the one in possession stays. That's what it means to have the presumption of ownership. But you have to be profiting from the land, right? Either living there or renting it out for money, or if it's a field that you're farming it, or if it's an orchard, right, that you're gathering the fruit each year. So here, if we're saying you consume the produce of an overcrowded orchard, right, where some of these trees are sort of destined to die soon, somehow this does not give you presumptive ownership, even though you harvested fruit from these overcrowded trees for 3 years. You didn't establish that chazaka, that presumption of ownership. And because some of these trees are about to die. And Rava objects to this. He says, if that is so, how does one ever acquire this alfalfa field, which is planted without spacing, where the nature of alfalfa is to be overcrowded? So rather, Rava said, if one sold an overcrowded orchard, the buyer does not have ownership of the land surrounding the trees. Generally, if one purchases 3 or more trees, he acquires the surrounding land, as the trees are considered an orchard. It takes 3 trees together to be called an orchard. But if the trees are overcrowded, they will soon have to be uprooted. They're going to either all of them are going to get sick and die, or some of them have to be removed. And that is why the buyer does not acquire the land surrounding the trees. Rabbi Zera said, this is like a dispute between Tanaim, the sages of the Mishnaic period, in Tractate Kilayim, right, where we're talking about diverse kinds. For example, you can't plant wheat in a vineyard. So with regard to a vineyard that is planted on an area where there is less than 4 cubits of open space between the vines, Rabbi Shimon says it is not considered a vineyard with regard to the prohibition of diverse kinds and other laws, as it is overcrowded. It's not a vineyard because it's not planted like a normal vineyard. It's planted in such a way that these vines are going to die. And the rabbis say this is considered to be a vineyard, and the reason for this is that the middle vines are viewed as if they are not there. The middle vines are going to die, those are going to be removed, and then what's left is a vineyard, and that's why we call this a vineyard, even though it's overcrowded. And it follows that according to the opinion of the rabbis, if one sold an overcrowded orchard, the middle trees would be viewed as if they were not there. Therefore, it would be considered an orchard, and the buyer would acquire the land surrounding the trees because it's legally defined as an orchard, even though some of those trees are going to die. Okay, so some of those trees are going to die, and what remains will be the orchard. And so this has the law of an orchard, and when you sell an orchard, you are selling the land around those trees and not just the trees themselves. Now, the sages of Nehardea say, this one who sells a date tree to another, the buyer acquires the land from its bottom until the depths, right? How deep do you get the land under the tree? As deep as you need. You get the land under the tree. Now on page 38a, Rava objects to this ruling that the buyer of the tree acquires the land beneath it, and let the seller say to him, I sold you only the saffron crocus, which is a small plant normally uprooted by the buyer and taken with him. Therefore, uproot the saffron crocus and go. Rather, Rava said this ruling is stated with regard to one who comes to court with a specific claim that the seller had stipulated that he would acquire the land. And without this specific claim, he does not acquire the land beneath the tree. So we're still trying to determine if the parties fail to specify exactly what's being bought and sold. Does the buyer get the land beneath the trees? Now, Mar Kashisha, and I'm almost done because we're going to stop with the end of the discussion of this Mishnah, and we'll pick it up with Mishnah number 2 tomorrow. So I'm almost done now. Questions or comments, please get them in. So Mar Kashisha, the son of Rav Chizda, said to Rav Ashi, and if in fact the seller sold him the saffron crocus, what was there for the seller to do to prevent the buyer from claiming the land beneath the tree? As the buyer could claim that there had been an explicit stipulation that he receive it. And Rav Ashi answered, he should have protested during the first 3 years and publicized that the land around the trees was not included in the sale. And the assumption that lodging a protest would be effective must be correct, since if you do not say so, then in the case of these mortgages, according to the custom of Sura that we discussed a couple days ago, the debtor will not have a way to prevent the creditor from keeping his land, right? These mortgages were like this: I lend you money, And then to get repaid, I know that you have a field, so I will take possession of your field for a certain amount of time, and I will consume the produce of that field. I'll farm it and grow it and have produce from it. And when that produce pays off the loan that I lent to you, then you get your field back, right? That's the deal. And when you get your field back, you don't have to pay any money for it. It's your field. I'm just consuming its produce until the loan that I extended to you is paid off. Why is it a problem? Because while I'm consuming this produce, maybe it takes more than 3 years. So I'm occupying your land. I'm farming it every day. I'm taking benefit from it. And if I do that for more than 3 years, I have a presumption of ownership of this land. Now, you would come to court if I said, and if I then claimed, yeah, this is my land. You would come to court and say, yeah, but no, Sal was only on that land because he lent me money, and our deal was that he's consuming the produce until the loan is paid off. And I could say, where's your evidence of that? Because I'm holding the promissory note that spells out this the terms of this arrangement. I have the promissory note until the loan is paid off. And if I'm a dishonest person and I don't present that document that proves the nature of our relationship, I could rip you off. Now, since that's the way these mortgages are done in the region of Sura, in Bava, within the ancient Persian Empire, it must be that the sages foresaw that somebody could take advantage of this, that an unscrupulous lender could take advantage of this to seize the land, and they wouldn't create a system where that could happen. So since this is done according to the custom of Sura, there's not going to be an assumption that I can take it just because I've been farming it, because it's known that in this region I might be farming it for 3 years, not because I bought it, but rather because I'm consuming the produce to pay off a loan, right? As in the mortgages of that type, it is written like this: at the completion of these years, this land will be released to the prior owner without any need for the prior owner to give money. If the creditor, right, if he was unscrupulous and he were to hide the mortgage document in his possession and say, this land is purchased, and that is why it is in my possession, here is it also the case that he would be deemed credible? That cannot be, as it is reasonable that the sages would institute a matter such as this type of arrangement, that people can be led by it to suffer a loss. The sages would never do that. So rather, in the case of the mortgage, the debtor had a chance to make sure that the land isn't taken away from him, but he has to publicize the matter. He has to lodge a protest. He has to let it be known that the reason Sal is on my land is because he lent me money and now he's consuming the produce. He has every opportunity to do that. If he doesn't take advantage of that, then he could have a real problem. Here too, in the case of the tree, the owner should have protested. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 3. And God willing, we'll pick it up tomorrow with Mishnah number 2 of chapter 3. Okay, like I said, quick class. Let's take a couple of questions and comments on Bava Basra 37. Bell, so do you get the land around the tree based upon the canopy of the tree, based upon when they are planted, or at maturity? So it's such a good question, right? You would think, well, if the reason you get this land under the tree is so you can work the tree, well, then you must have as much land as you need under the whole canopy, right? Because fruit is going to drop from the whole width of the canopy. Well, let's read what the law actually says. Hold on. Okay, if one sold 3 trees in his field and retained the land for himself, the buyer acquires the land surrounding the trees, required to care for and harvest the fruit of the trees. The Rima writes, citing the Tur, that this is limited to the land between the trees. And the Rima also writes, citing the Tur, that even if the seller explicitly retained the land between the trees for himself, the buyer still has the right to replace the trees if they wither. Right? So because you get the land, if the tree falls down, you can replant another tree. And this is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, who holds that one who sells generously. But they didn't answer your question about the canopy. I think it's a really good question. Okay, here, if one sold a parcel of land and retained ownership of its trees, he also retains half of the land. Others hold that he retains only the land that is necessary to harvest the produce of those trees. So even if he retained only 2 trees for himself, but he retains ownership of the land necessary to collect the produce of these trees. But I think what you're asking me is, well, what about if the canopy grows? Right? If the canopy grows and you need more land in order to get at the fruit on branches that's extending away from the trunk, does your parcel of land grow with it? Or are we just going to say that at the time of the sale, you got as much land as you need so you can harvest the tree? And that's what you got. And if the tree extends beyond that, okay, well then you have the issue of your tree has branches growing over somebody else's land, and we handle it that way. Or do we say, well, you just need enough land to tend to the tree, and you have a right to harvest your fruit by walking onto the owner of the surrounding land's land, just to get at the fruit, but you don't have that ownership. I mean, these are unanswered questions. I don't have the answers to that, but great question, Bell. You show that you understood the matter. Sharon, I am struggling a bit understanding how one can buy a tree which is planted on another's land. What about access to the trees, right? So not just the land right underneath the tree that you need in order to, literally tend to the tree, but what about getting to the tree, right? That's the easement that I've been talking about. And it's a great question. You got to have some kind of an arrangement with the owner so that you can get there. And if the question is, if they didn't negotiate that, if they forgot to mention it, right? Or if he thought that he would always have an unencumbered right, that would be no problem because he had a path next to the stream, but then sometimes a stream changes course. And now, that and then the guy ends up farming the land that was no longer by the stream. And now you don't have that easement, but you own the trees and just the land immediately beneath them. Then how do you get to your trees? The answer might be that you have to make a new deal and it's going to cost you more money to get that easement. I don't know, but it's a great question. It's certainly something that this is why, anybody who's been learning this, not just one more reason that we should always be learning Torah. Somebody who learns this will be sure that the next time he's in a negotiation, the fine print isn't just blah, 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 blah. The fine print is I got to read it, I got to understand it. And if I can't read it and understand it, I got to bring somebody who does so that I get the benefit of the bargain that I think I'm getting, the benefit of the deal that I think I'm getting. Lawyers are like nuclear weapons. The other side has theirs. You got to have yours. Bill, good heavens, this takes me back. When Nana passed, I, very, very briefly, for reasons that I may go into later, thought about retaining the farm and ended up selling it in 2 parts. First, the 40 acres of timber to pay off the mortgage, and then the homestead when it became clear staying was a non-starter. When we sold the timberland, we were legally required by the state of Arkansas to grant an easement that then had to be meticulously defined and described because there was technically no access to the timber from the public road in the absence of such an easement. The buyer didn't really want the easement because he was the protege of the cattle baron who was our neighbor. He knew good and well he could get to the timber easier that way, but the law demanded an easement. So an easement there was. Funnily enough, the easement only made sense on paper to meet the legal requirements. It was a long, narrow strip down the side of the property through gullies and woods and hills and not 1 but 2 creeks. That's property law for you, I suppose, in a nutshell. Very good. Thank you for sharing that story, Bill. That's what I've got for us today, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Tuesday at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific.